Welcome back, everyone, and please do join us. We're hoping to be joined by people, and for Hennie, Ben, and Rachel, when you feel like, if and when you feel that you would like to join, please feel free. And in some way, wherever you and others are in the room, we will rope you into these conversations. So welcome back from lunch. And welcome, Scott Delahunta.
Hi. Am I okay, Francesco? Am I mic'd up? Is it testing? 1, 2. Or did I hit? It's okay. Testing. Yeah. No. A little bit. There's a little. Oh, I hear some amplification. Yes. Yeah. We're good.
Good. Well, Guido and I and the project are so happy that you're able to be here today. For me, and I think for both of us, Scott has for many years been a very a person who conversations with Scott have been very important to us for many, many years. I think even before Guido and I ever met, I was having conversations with Scott that were helping me to figure out what I was trying to do. And so we've invited you to help us keep doing that. And I think Scott will talk a bit about some of your background and how it relates to NEUROLIVE and the type of project that NEUROLIVE is. But yes, you are a researcher and you have a lot of expertise in these kind of interdisciplinary cross art and science, particularly dance engaging science.
Okay. Thank you, Matthias. And Guido for the invitation, and I've been here since Monday, for those of you who've just come today. And the opportunity to be in this space for the last few days while the project, that pretty much everybody involved in the project has been in the space. I think some of the assistants and others, the 50 or so other people who've been mentioned off and on haven't been here so much, but I think everybody who's made a significant contribution has been here this week. And there have been panel discussions also. Micah Bleeker was the very first panel discussion on helping us understand the origin of the project in a way in terms of the concept of liveness. And that was, Guido reported on how that happened for you. And Micah gave us sort of a kind of short discourse on liveness from a perspective of kind of history and cultural contexts and reference points, some of the reading that you'd had. And then it opened up into a conversation more generally around that topic, and began to open up the whole project to me in a way that I hadn't understood that I would start to experience. And then Efrosini talked in the afternoon about sort of outputs and various things going on. So we've had all of these opportunities. I've had all these opportunities to get rather quickly a deep insight into what the heck went on for 5 years. It's pretty remarkable, I can tell you. And I feel a lot of responsibility to draw attention to that dimension of the project because I feel that I don't really know what I can offer on some level. But I tried to think about that because my colleague and friend Phil Barnard is here, with whom I've worked for a long time. Phil's a theoretical cognitive psychologist, sitting right here next to Sue Davies. Sue I've also have a long relationship with. And I tried to think about the origins of my own kind of interest in this space between, let's just call it dance and science, to keep it to a kind of a single frame to work around. And I tried to think about how I could possibly share things that have evolved since roughly 1999, 98 in a rather short frame of time. Like, what did I learn And because of the things that I learned have resonated for me in these few days. So I recognize things that I discovered just by trial and error over many, many conversations and opportunities to meet with people and share space together. So, I remember that, it's probably useful to say that I consider myself to have a dance practice background. So the position from which I sort of would relate to people and, start a conversation would be, I'm coming from dance practice. So not sort of dance studies or scholarship necessarily, but it was always sort of a practitioner place that I would take. So in the 80s, up till the early 90s, I was still making work and performing in various contexts. But I slipped into the sort of artistic research developments in the UK in the 90s. That's when these things were kind of happening, which I think you very much resonate with in this project more than we were doing in the 90s in terms of having a presence on the UK landscape as an opportunity for artists to engage in research on a slightly shifted landscape. But I think that in the late 90s, in 99, 2000, 2001, I did remember that I had an opportunity to work with Sue, Wayne McGregor, Shobhanit Jaya Singh, and Ashley Page in a small project which was called Software for Dancers. The idea is the idea is that we could, the four of you could have conversations about your making practice, and I invited a handful of creative coders to come in, listen to them describing your making practice, and speculate about what kind of software could be developed specifically for dancers. So not something you borrowed from some other field, for example, but specifically for what could augment dance practice in some way in the studio. And those conversations that the four of you had were the things I think I learned from most, because the level of the conversation was very high. And it reminds me of the curational dimension that you guys were mentioning a little bit. I think it was you, Rachel, the level, or maybe it was Hennie, the level of practitioners involved in this project, your selections, has something to do, I think, with the quality of engagement and the kind of the attention on relationships and things. So I had the opportunity to realize it, to explore that. We made no software. So there was no software developed, which is not surprising, probably on some level, because it's a whole other thing. But I took away from that project that kind of understanding, and also that I enjoyed facilitating that kind of stuff. People talking to each other about dance practice, like how they make things, and how clear they could be with each other in a room where others might not be present, but maybe listening, but that there was a languaging going on there that was precise, that was came from experience, and that could be relied on and shared more widely. And we also, in that time, went to 2 labs. So we also took the opportunity to visit the mixed reality lab with Steve Benford up in Nottingham, who works a lot with blast theory. And we went to Sussex, where we visited the cognitive science and AI lab with Phil Husbands, and it's a long time ago. But that was an opportunity to, we went together to those and then explained and had that conversation with scientists. But that's the first time I'd ever done anything like that. And I also found that to be interesting. But we didn't take that too far. But it was Wayne in particular who was interested in, as you would know from his public image and everything, is he's very interested in science and very interested in technology. So he wanted to continue working with scientists, and that's the project then that kind of sort of, I got very introduced to working together with scientists in the studio space. And that's where Matthias, so you were working with Wayne at that time. And we got £30,000 to do 6 months sort of exploratory work with scientists. We had 5. Phil was one of them who joined the project. But again, curation comes into play, because Wayne and I met maybe a dozen cognitive scientists with the proposal to have a conversation about kinesthetic intelligence. So what was that? And what you knew about, or what you were theorizing about the way in which cognition was working, is something we could learn from, or kind of or sort of, what was the word you used in terms of appropriate bits and pieces that we could learn from and understand. And, but within 6 months, which is a lot shorter than 5 years, what we did, so curation was important because we then invited particular people who had expressed interest and curiosity about what we were interested in doing, that made Wayne and I feel confident that we could have we could work together productively. So there was always that curational dimension to it, sort of meeting. That won't surprise you. This project, I feel, is sort of filled with that sort of, working with people with whom you feel close. And in that context, Phil, you guys came and we offered the whole company, you were part of the company then, to be available for experiments. And this is interesting regarding your last thing, because we didn't take the view that you guys have had more time to evolve different sort of formats and relationships and balances between art making and so the scientific research. There we just said, we've got 6 months, and the best way to learn about what you could offer would be to say, the company's in the process of making something, come into the studio and have a look at how that's going. Let's have a conversation about it, and then perhaps you can come up with a proposal for how you could probe or investigate an aspect of that phenomenon that you found interesting. And you all came and did something with us, but an element of that was explaining what was happening before. This goes to what you were saying earlier, and then having a conversation about what had happened afterwards. So there was always a conversation. There was never really an attempt to produce something of scientific importance. It was more about establishing a ground of understanding and just getting to know what each one of us, what the other person knew. But it brings me to, and then we, and Phil and I in particular, and with Wayne and with the company changed and evolved, but we had the opportunity, and I feel very fortunate to have had the chance to, and the conditions were right as well. I mean, the conditions that you have resources, you have resources available to you for various reasons. When you're working with a known company, these are elements that shouldn't be forgotten, that there are certain things that were in place that made that possible to be exploratory, to be resourceful. But it did feel that fundamental to that project for me then became friendship, and in particular friendship with Phil. And we worked together Phil and I continue working together, but I kind of worked in that role with Wayne for about 10 years. And the very last thing that we did was an exhibition at the Wellcome Collection called Mind and Movement that was up for 6 weeks. And in some ways, what I've been invited and lucky enough to be to have shared here in this space reminds me of that, a kind of summary of all of the various things that went on in that space, in the space of making. But we were lucky enough to have it 6 weeks up, and for a lot of public to be able to wander through that space and to get insight into how those dance science collaborations what had taken place. Then, in the meantime, I had begun to. Bill Forsyth was also very interested in the late '90s. He also had a relationship with he was very interested in the way the mind worked, and he was organizing symposia around brains and cognition and movement and dance. So he also was somebody who gravitated towards that kind of material, you could say. Not all artists feel comfortable doing that, so it was something he gravitated to. And in the meantime, we separately sort of to it, but related, was a project called Motion Bank that got set up. But in the context of Motion Bank, in the first phase, which started in 2010, we also received some funding from the Volkswagen Foundation in Germany to do a project called Dance Engaging Science, which is a phrase you used. And that phrase for me sort of stood for the idea that dancers could be more involved. There had been a fair amount of dance science research going on, But I think what you've done really well here is to blur and create equal partners on that kind of a level playing field where the science is not just studying the dance. And that we were interested in doing something more like that, and that's where I met Guido. You came and participated in that project with Patrick, because you were studying with Patrick Haggard at that time at UCL. And you're back at UCL. It's amazing. So, I've been very fortunate to have had these opportunities to be in these spaces where conversations take place and learning takes place. But the last thing I want to say, and just to sort of frame what I hope we could begin exploring a little bit in this panel, in this conversation, is that, and I thought that, to look at my notes a little bit, I took so many notes these last few days, I can tell you. Yesterday, Beatrice, whom I also know from years ago, asked questions about, I think, kind of a bit provocative about what do you think neuroscience will gain from this research, and what do you think the arts will gain from this research. But she did elicit comments from everybody at the end, and Albana, you're here? You said something that really hit me. You said, I think generally there was a sense that everybody wished that you could continue, like literally continue. There's a need to continue to process data, but like the community itself, what Ben called, I think, a family, the sense of family, the sense of community could continue in some way. Because you said it'd be a shame, and there would be such a loss of knowledge and experience somehow. And I may be misinterpreting what you said, but that notion of loss of knowledge is something I feel that Phil and I thought a lot about at various points in time, and finally wrote a paper that I think is really interesting called Audit Traces. But the idea was, and I'm going to refer to this, was to try to conceptualize the notion of traces that might help us think about when processes of different disciplines overlap. So down. What occurs at this intersection of ideas and methods may not appear in the end products of a collaborative research project. So that may not appear also speaks to some kind of loss. Now, some of that loss we would accept in terms of our engagement and commitment to the ineffable, ephemeral, live thingy. So some of that we would accept. But I think what Phil and I were interested in trying to conceptualize was some notion that there are valuable things being lost in this interaction, which are not accounted for. And would it not be possible to start to conceptualize some sort of generic language or model for capturing these processes that don't end up in the final products necessarily? And I really do think of two circles overlapping, just to keep it simple. And you know, and let's just keep it simple and say dance and science circles. And in a way, the whole project has explored keeping that whole thing in place, because sometimes you try to make art that doesn't get interfered with by the science, so it stands on its own. So sometimes you're trying to publish in a high-end journal, science journal, tough job, but to try to publish it to make an impact there in this field. So this is it's complex. But in the middle where it's overlapping, everything's bleeding in different ways. Like Jayu's experience with seeing the data for the first time and talking about what that seems to affirm for you as a performer. All that stuff is going on in the middle there someplace, and it doesn't really get accounted for. Now, and I think that you and I, we talked about whether this kind of thing, what the future might be for this kind of project. And the tricky thing is that I feel that you don't want to establish a new field of dance science, like a new overlap. This simply would destroy what's taking place at the intersection. It would become something else. But what could you do to kind of validate or draw attention to a little bit more systematically what takes place in those exchanges where you don't know what's happening, you're working something out, And I've heard many, many moments during these few days when somebody says something that it strikes me that that's what's occurring there at that moment. But it's not the thing you focus on. You sort of say, well, that's how we got to this thing, and then that decision gets made, then there's a slide that shows it. So what I would like to do, and if you would bear with me somehow, is in this panel, this kind of conversation, is to invite observations about what those things might have been that are difficult to account for, but were somehow fundamental in the exchanges and the sharing that was taking place. I sometimes felt in my, is that you would drop the label in some ways. You'd no longer be the dancer and the scientist. There'd be some moment where you're like, I have no idea what's going on here. But there's no name for it. It simply is taking place. And you have to, and negotiation's a word that you both use quite a lot. Kind of negotiate that space. I did, when we spoke about this panel at one point, I said, well, at the end of Dance Engaging Science, I'd written a short piece of paper, like 2 pages, where I'd specified 7 basic principles for collaborative research between dance and science. And I thought, should I talk about these? Should I talk about these? And then I think I mailed it and I said, wow, we could send these to the panel beforehand. They could think about them. It makes no sense because it's all happening here in your project. They're already happening. All the 7 principles are happening in this project. So it doesn't make any sense to talk about those. The main thing I think would be interesting, just because I think it goes to the heart of the interdisciplinary relation, is to try to think about what's lost in there, or what might be accounted for. I think that's what I would say as a kind of framing. And I had a few. I won't ask Matthias. Matthias, you're so articulate about, so careful with your, and in some ways I'd love to turn to you and say, what do you think about my framing and my proposal? But I'm not going to. I'm going to, and Guido as well. I think I'll leave you guys out for a moment, because I would I'll just start with Ben, if you don't mind. And we have to have mics passed around, if that's okay, or maybe somebody can have a mic. And is there a portable one? Or Ben, come on over here. And because you said something, I think it was yesterday, and I might be wrong again. I feel like I'm picking up bits and pieces and I'm writing them down and then I report them back. And chances are good it's not what you thought you said. But I think you said something about language that reminded me of languaging or having conversations yesterday. It was, and I believe it was at the end of. Do you, Connor? Moments describe.
Well, there's a moment that I remember. Tell me if this is the one, when Ben was sat over here and was talking about a particular process that we went through. That was around, this was 2 days ago, not 1 day ago, around the introduction of the EEG resting state recording and how that was languaged, and the process that we went through to arrive at how that was languaged. Is this what you're thinking of?
Yes.
So that was in the context of that is in the Performance 4, which was the work that I made, and that Ben was a collaborating performer in.
Is there more you want to say, Scott?
Oh, thanks, Ben. Yes, maybe because there are people who haven't been here to have been immersed in all this information. Let's see how we could set this up. If you, who were you in conversation with, and I guess maybe a little bit of the context for that.
Okay, so I think we as a team within Readings of What Was Never Written, which is the 4th performance to which I was referring, would have been in conversation with Laura, who I think you took the floor to speak, about, to kind of frame, like, practically what's happening here and what the invitation is to an audience, you know. So we're inviting you to look at this place on the wall, and it's going to last this, you know, there's information to translate. What happened? I think, I mean, my memory of that is that, you know, maybe it was a little bit of, I don't know about feedback, but just something reciprocal enough where it's okay enough to suggest or propose that there's something around the tone or the languaging itself that enables the practicalities to be transmitted, but also happens within a way that is within and seeding the context, the environment, the work itself, that space of the dance and science meeting in this particular performance iteration is nuanced and specific to that. So rather than, if a different example of that might have been, well, it just happens in this way and then we deal with what that is. Collaboratively, it seems that what this project has supported over these 5 years is somehow enabling a flow of ideas and information across between these disciplines in that interface. There's enough generosity and willingness for everybody to sort of make this thing work where it feels like that's okay for someone to suggest something different. My memory of that is that you then tried some different things and we sort of worked out, you know, well, what's right for this. And I think that's what I meant about specific language and the tone of what that languaging is. That's, yeah, that's for that.
Laura, do you want to... So for those who haven't, if you weren't here before, Ben's the dance side, Laura's the science side, in this context.
Yeah, so to me, the idea of a resting state recording is like one of the most kind of a very simple 3 to 5 minute task that people do in front of a computer. So I have quite a strict set of instructions that I'm used to, that I've used in various positions throughout the past 10 years. And then, yeah, coming into this, it's like, okay, putting a cross in front of somebody on a wall is not really gonna work here. And I think in that situation, a really creative solution came about where people looked at a certain element of lighting in the performance space that was interesting. And also for me, I think I'm not used to being in front of an audience in that way. So having to refine and practice the tone of the language and everything like that is so different to anything that I've done before. So that was quite a unique experience for me personally. Normally I just would type that into my script and it would play on a computer. And so, yeah, it just becomes something very different in the live context.
Iris, you've been producing all this work, and Matthias was commenting on the kind of zoomed in and zoomed out perspective you had. When I describe these moments that take place, were you witness to some things like this? Can you say something about what you noticed?
Yeah, absolutely. I had such a clear response to this example that Ben gave yesterday about the resting state, and many examples over the years of creating the right conditions for live performance to be experienced but also recognized as live performance. And I was just talking to Hennie and just having so many reflections over the last 2 days of trying to remember what it was like in the first year, what we hadn't learnt, what we've learnt now, and the conversations that, and a lot of negotiations of how do we present this information to people who will then understand that their role of coming to this is as an audience member. And one of the things that I think we really enjoyed, me and Hennie, we had kind of a sort of equal kind of or similar role in the artistic and the scientific team of being the kind of connecting, communicating kind of person, was working out how do we transmit the information about EEG setup for audiences coming to a performance that is both a live performance and a scientific experiment, and to present that information in a way that made them understood. I'm entering into a performance experience. So exactly like what you said, Laura, about the information that you normally would have given, like in a consent form, information sheet, questionnaire or email. Me and Hennie, we talked a lot about how can we do this that is not in a clinical sense, but in a video, or so we made videos of how, like, the whole EEG setup, and it was just a lot of finding creative solutions to making sure that we brought our experience as audience members. And I think that's what I've been thinking a lot about when we talk about dance as a discipline, science as a discipline. What we've all together brought was our experience as audience members of what it feels like to be an audience, and why that's important that we bring that into this research. So, yeah.
Nice. Hennie, do you have anything you want to add to that in terms of?
Yes, it's been almost 5 years, and there's just a lot of memories also coming back. I think something also what Iris mentioned, and perhaps other people as well, I just remember there were this constant shifting of weights, almost like of negotiation happening in any given year, any given productions that we've done as part of NEUROLIVE. And I also just remember thinking how, like, Guido, Matthias and Iris, and just everyone, like, holding the space, and it just kind of, I just remember kind of being like, oh wow, I'm witnessing this kind of shifting of weights and all these negotiations happening, and how everyone's kind of like holding themselves in terms of like how to communicate that to each other. And I've just been like very impressed many times, but I can't remember like specific moments, but just in general, it was great to witness that.
The in the last session with the dog, I can't call you the dogs. Dog Kennel Hill. I can't quite do it. The Dog Kennel Hill is the group that did one of the performance things, and you were on the panel before. And Hennie, you mentioned there you are. This Hennie here, learning and letting go. And I think that many of these moments that I'm interested in drawing attention to are moments of learning, or moments you could discovery. And then I felt that when you couple those two things together, the learning and letting go at the same time seems to me to constitute a different dynamic of exploring something. And I think that your project in particular seemed to, because of the back and forth and close communication and facilitation from Guido and Matthias, I think those two things really kind of resonated for me. Ben, in that context, talking about what I'd mentioned earlier, community and family, but there's also a reference to shifting and repositioning, like things that are shifting and repositioning, but the coherence, and now I forget, I'll just say it, Hennie said it. I think you said the shifting and repositioning because you were speaking a little at that time, and then perhaps it was you that said something about, nevertheless it felt there was a coherence, this sense of holding. The word being held has come up quite a lot in these few days, like how something is held. And some of that has to do with the two of you and how you, because in the context of the project, you're the two directors, and how you've chosen to do things, your own negotiation between you. But I don't think it's only you. It's a general principle that seems to be at play in this project, which again makes it unique but not unreplicable. In other words, unique to this project, but it has properties, I think, and principles involved that could be repeated again. And I can say that with some assurance because I feel like you're repeating things that I learned myself. So if I just speak to my experience, I feel like that's why there's no reason to read the collaborative principles, because they're happening here. So I think that, but that being held by the project, and the other word, appetite for willingness to work within that family, that might have been bad. My apologies really but there's some sense that the three of you, perhaps because of also your long working relation, had a way of articulating dimensions of these relations, which I felt resonate with my own sense of what's important in the frame of this opportunity to work together, because that's really what it is. It's an opportunity to work together, I think. I think, though, that one of the things I have discovered in the past, and this relates to the notion of audit traces, is that it's hard to back-propagate what the audit traces are. You're stuck with memories. You're sort of like, what can I remember from those moments? What did I notice about, where communication was happening that was kind of unique? You're left with anecdotes and observations. And it doesn't do us a lot, in some ways, to be more systematic about it would be tricky, but I do wonder, maybe this is something for the two of you, whether or not if you sort of agree with this notion that kind of fundamental cohesion has, I'll be provocative, has nothing to do with the scientific output around liveness. The cohesion has nothing to do with the artworks necessarily, but it's some other dynamic that's at play in this space of negotiation. Do you think there's a way to have, if you in principle, if you kind of follow that and think that there's something there, is there a way that you would say that can be traced or could have been, or let's say you had 5 more years. So just you had 5 more years of funding. Could you imagine capturing more of those moments somehow, or how might you pay attention to that kind of thing? Unless you think that it's something different.
I'm not entirely sure about the how to capture part of it. I mean, for me, it's always my notebook. I have many of exactly the same notebook that are in stacks, that I have in stacks at home with writing that is only legible to me. So yes, I do feel that the way of working together is a thing in itself, and also that it holds a lot of meaning. And for me, part of my motivation for being in the project is to do with the way of working together itself, and for instance the positioning of the artistic practices within that. Also maybe where that's happening, that it's happening here, is also important to me. It also makes me want to say that, so yes, you're talking about the principles that you wrote. It was really good to look at those the other day, because I totally agree. I completely recognize our environment in them, and there is something always important about how seeing something happening, or your past experience of these kinds of ways of working, which both Guido and I have had in different ways in contexts that you've been involved in, that makes it possible for us to sort of imagine and aim towards, helps to make it possible to aim towards the way that we're working now. yeah, but I'm not entirely sure about how to capture, but that there are a lot of things about, again, this example that we just talked about is a good sort of micro example of the way that the needs of the artistic work and the way that the needs of the interdisciplinary work are being negotiated, and that just has to keep on being negotiated. It's always a new negotiation. Like each year we've kind of started again.
Yeah. I mean, I think in this environment, I mean, one of the things that occurs to me, that one of the principles I think was, you can start with a goal, but the goal might change. In other words, there's change all the time in these contexts. And so the negotiation is partly managing that change in appropriate and ethical and sensitive ways. But it's happening all the time, and I think the notion of letting go even goes to the point of letting go of certain kinds of goals. The goals are a kind of part of the overall change dynamic that takes place, is that they can be renegotiated as well. But that never stops in a way. That's continuous throughout the process. And the tricky thing is, in terms of capturing it, it's probably not the right word to use. And to be honest, I don't know. I don't think Phil didn't get beyond the idea of writing a conceptual paper about the possibility one might look at a way to trace those intersections when you've got people coming from very different ways of looking at things and very different ways of knowing. But embracing those very different ways of knowing and very different ways of looking at things seems to me to have been fundamental to this project as well. Yep.
Just add a little bit more. So, something about, like the changing of the goals. That there's something particular in relation to this project, which has been very production oriented. We've had like a production schedule, which has been quite fast, really. A new production every year, and that turnaround has been like quite dynamic. And and also this kind of almost like a double production. Each year there's the artistic production and there's the scientific production. And so I think in terms of in this project, the like renegotiating of the goals is almost like sometimes like a revision in between years. I don't really feel that there is time or possibility for much renegotiation within 1 year.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot to do with I think a lot about the starting points that we choose to begin from are super important, and they determine a lot. And so like things like specifically the thing I mentioned this morning about the invitation to the dogs, and the in year 3, and the specific invitation to be dealing with both liveness and measurement as subjects. And also there was a specific invitation to have EEG worn by performers. And so like those kind of starting points, we're already like in a very particular place, and then we run with that with immense complexity. But that's a very particular starting point. And starting from another place would be very different. And I really feel that there's only so far that you can shift once the train leaves the station.
Yeah, I think I've been trying to think about this now. So I think I agree with Matthias completely that a lot of it happens beforehand. So, I mean, I was thinking about this in talking to a colleague of mine, so other sort of scientists who hold ERC grants, and the project in which this project is different from all other ERC or typical science project is normally what happens is you apply for a project, you get the money, and then you start thinking again. And there's sort of there's often not much resemblance between what an initial proposal was and how it turns out to be. And if I go through our application from 2019, there's actually almost like we've really did what we said we would, which is kind of like that never happens. And I think that has something to do practically that in the collaboration with SDS and with artists, sort of you need to provide that certainty. You know, if we say we are going to do 4 performances, one each year, then those 4 performances need to happen each year. Whereas in a scientific process, I might go like, well, let's just see how that experiment goes, and then we'll analyze it and publish it, and then we'll think again. But I can't do that. And so that's sort of an acceptance, or like a setup that needs to be accepted right at the start. So like we need to sort of stick to that. And it's a little bit like once the train has started, you can't deviate from that. I think there's also something about, I'm not sure how sort of like it is, but there's something really about in that process of setup, like it's really about who is part of it on the but also on the scientific side. And I was thinking, what is it on the science side that sort of we all share? And I was thinking, is it an interdisciplinary background? And that's true for some, but not everybody has sort of an artistic background, like Sonia or others do not, they're sort of interested, but they're not artists in that sense. And so I was thinking, like, I think there's something else about, that's really a question to others in the science team as well. I'm wondering if there's something about, for me, it's about interdisciplinarity, that's true, but it's also something around, there's a career that I could have had that never happened, and I've become a scientist. And but in that process, I'm sort of aware and I'm driven to and sort of passionate about something else that I sort of want to see, I want to be part of and want to come in. So there's sort of something about, so there's a sort of other part of me that sort of has never been, or like, which I gave up for. And so I think there's something about that, which, that's a question to the others, if there's an element of that you could have been someone else, and in that, professionally, not personally maybe, but, and there's something that, in that sort of desire, there's something in that project for me. I don't know how else to put that.
I think we can open up a bit, because, thank you. Rachel and then Anya.
Provoking something about being witnessed in our practices by others that are other. And there's something for me about hearing you speak of that makes me think about performance. This kind of way that we can be visible to each other in our practices, and they're held in these very particular ways that allow for things to be seen and revealed.
Yeah.
And that's for me is kind of a performance. So.
No, but that seems to resonate so nicely with what Guido said. And Anya, you had a question you wanted to ask. This over here.
Perhaps a provocation. Because Guido, I saw you dancing yesterday. And I'm quite stunned by the kind of splitting that is often present in the language here, and I'm thinking about the art of science, and what I'm hearing is that it's so hard to bring the artist to the scientific practice, and perhaps because my mother tongue is German, and there, of course, people talk of Tanzwissenschaft, right? It is a science, but, well, that's a longer discussion of the etymology of Wissenschaft, of course. But I guess my main comment, I'm not sure whether that's a question or provocation, is why, and I'm experiencing that myself, why can it be so hard to bring the artist or practitioner into some organizational practices, or into, why is there such a splitting between the arts and the sciences, and to bring your whole self to scientific experimentation. And that wasn't what I was seeing yesterday in the performance lecture. But I'm seeing it today when you speak.
I think, well, it's interesting that you bring up the lecture performance, but I think it is in a, yes, that lecture performance embodies my dual background, and I can speak to both audiences, I can combine it. But I still think there were some scientists in the audience, and for them that's still an artistic output, a very clearly one. It's not a scientific output, because it doesn't comply with the framework of scientific work. It's a subjective story that I'm telling, which refers to both of those, but in its method and in its presentation and in its what it uses, it is very much artistic. I guess that's what I would say. And I think the challenge in bringing together is not so much about the people, it is about acknowledging that these different evolutions of practices, which have, and I can definitely speak to that, it takes a lot of time to become proficient in any of these. And so just to learn also, and it's kind of like if you want to combine it, it's very rare that you have the chat. Like I was lucky enough, because I studied in Germany and never paid for my studies, to have a formal education in both of these, you know? But like that's, in the UK, I don't see how that's possible in that way, you know?
But don't you think you bring your creativity to your scientific practice anyhow?
Oh, totally.
It's very, very particular, unique perspective.
Totally, but like the you know, sort of the fact of producing, I mean, I have to go back to output, sort of like, yes, or at a sort of abstract and a sort of personal level that is very ingrained and very combined in me, but the work, the act of making a work, publishing a scientific paper with all its data, all its analyses, is something that just, to do that, you know, sort of, I mean, I'm now sort of at a stage where I sort of feel like this is like, together with Laura, we've written for the first time, like, aiming towards a really high impact journal. And what is required in that process, how long it takes, and how much knowledge it requires for me, and that's not interdisciplinary, you know, it's sort of very deeply interdisciplinary, and I need to speak to people who also aren't interdisciplinary in this way. They're really excited about this, but I need to comply with the rules of the discipline. And I think the same, I think that relates very much to what Matthias said, or what Seke says about the artworks, that it needs to stand on its own. I think that's true for the artists themselves as well. There is, you know, sort of there's a long-term practice. If you do something, you know, sort of like to do it in that way, it's, you know, it requires a long time, a lot of expertise to get to that point that, you know, you can see it if it has that, you know.
And I mean, I think that's what makes this a collection of individual, you know, a group of people working together who are bringing these different specialisms in and are able to move between these places to a degree. Because I used your comment, Alban, at the beginning, would you mind maybe saying something about what you meant when you talked about loss?
Yes. I think it's very close to what you said after. I just think it's related to two things, and something that you said a bit later, Matthias, too, and that I asked a question about on the first day. I think it's both the fact that all this knowledge and all this practice that we got all together, both for each performance, but also on the overall project, that's something that we embody. And so the fact that it's like, it can be reproduced, but also it's something that it's held by us, but also it's held in this space too. And I think it's something very specific. And even though you can reproduce it, you will have to learn it again in a different way, in a different place, with other people. That's why I was speaking about loss. There is always loss in this aspect, but that was very much what you were getting to after, so I don't really have a big comment on that.
I think maybe Seki, please, yes.
When you were talking about things that are lost or what can we hold on to, I was thinking about the curation of the works, and I think for me something that NeuroLive has opened up is a space for a certain kind of practice to be funded, I guess, and it's not necessarily that the different artists are not funded elsewhere, but I think the specific works themselves are all very, I would say they're all very slippery and ambiguous, and I think that's partly to do with the taste of Matthias and Guido and who happened to be available and all of that kind of thing. But I think I do think there's something to do with the context of it being A, about liveness, and B, in a science experiment, that it had to, maybe didn't have to, but there's some sort of invitation to ambiguity and things that are not necessarily that straightforward to describe or kind of nail down. There's something very slippery about whether it's performing or not performing, or a show that happens over 2 days with 50 people, some of whom are not professional performers, some have their kids involved. It's like, it's not the kind of work that's being sort of generally celebrated, let alone funded. So I just think that's something that I feel like, that's a shame that from that point of view, I feel like, it's a shame NeuroLive is stopping, because where's the space for those sorts of works to happen, irrespective of whether they're happening inside a scientific experiment.
That's a very interesting observation. I wonder about this notion of reciprocity. So you're that you're getting this, because that strikes me as fundamental here as well, a sense of reciprocity. So there's reciprocal, things are going back and forth, and things are shared mutually, and that within those conditions, that unusual artworks, and your work in particular is one I think that was meant to stand on its own, to use that phrase. So it wasn't permeated quite as much with the scientific, the devices, and the collaboration with with the Delahunta Hill or others, or different from. They were all very different. Also, Ayu's piece was very different in the relation with science and the relation with the measuring. I think there are observations to be made about that dimension as well, just those, which I think you're planning to write a little bit more about too, which would be very useful to see. But I suppose in that space of reciprocality, that there's ways of sharing, and I coming back to this notion of what is lost, and the poor choice of word always, which is the word capture. I think somehow I'm reminded of something that Iris, you said about. I think you referred to things that we couldn't get release forms, very sort of some of the standards that come into play with scientific research, any kind of research, that sometimes mitigate. How do you work around things? Sometimes I suppose that you like workarounds. Perhaps is a functioning kind of method of doing things. Getting another word for negotiation. Yes, sir.
I just want to follow on from what Seki said, because it's also something I've been thinking about in terms of the conditions that we've been talking about, the conditions of live performance, but also the condition or the funding context that we are in, that has been so unique from an artistic production perspective, that we have been able to create these performances outside of an artistic funding context. And I think, and I would love to hear from all the artists and from Matthias just how that has shifted and changed the process, because I really felt that from within, because I also performed in some of the works, and just was so liberating that the artistic works and scientific process alongside were driven by investigation of liveness, and that the funding had already been pitched and granted, and that, you know, we did have a limit to the overall budget. I'm just talking practical sense-wise. But each year, each invitation, we could shape what we wanted to do to the artist and to the concept and the question. And that, just from a producer perspective, was incredible to be able to do that.
I just want to add something about working around this artistic and scientific interest. So when I get this proposal to do this experiment, it was outside of the commission, but I think there's always this kind of choreographic instinct that you just kind of smuggle into the process, or you smuggling into the doing. So then, even though I think it's very clear the structure and outset and how we agreed upon, but there are always moments that either you are kind of compelled by the moment, or you kind of see something that you could just go with it, and that in itself is a very much an artistic construction. So, and also in my collaboration, we have our band coming into the space. So that's almost, to me, conceptually, a science coming into the kind of artistic performative space. Then you look out, and then I see Merkel working on the computer instead of music technicians press the sound and I dance. No, it's not. It's different from that. So in that context, I feel very much like a co-investigator. We are all looking into this phenomenon of performing and not performing. So we are really investigating the whole thing together. So I think that's more like how I frame this as I'm working around.
Yeah, that's a nice observation. It reminds me of why I asked Sonia where she does her work. Like, where do you do your work, and are other people in the space with you? And so maybe these principles for what, you know, for sort of paying attention to what, I mean, they're, in a way, they're things you know and you're doing already, so but sometimes they're things that perhaps it's worth, you know, noticing them, kind of heightening awareness of the fact that Mirko was in the corner doing something. It's not like it was designed exactly like that, but it has this effect of resonating, creating relationality that resonates, and I like, you know, the smuggling things in. I think that you know, it's something that I like, that sort of. It's not really working around. It's like smuggling something in. It's like, you know. And so there'd be a different kind of awareness, and probably these moments that are kind of lost because they're ineffable and they're intuitive and they are emotional and they're filled with piles of affect, and is that they would be slightly different. They're not all the same ways of doing things. They're kind of slightly different strategies, like really. And I think that well, obviously, I'm just my bias is towards an interest in this kind of thing, and trying to figure out how to articulate what that is, I suppose.
I think one thing that sort of, if we're talking about sort of things, or like, I just had an idea of something that is not captured, and I think that's something I learned from you, actually, in the way you hold spaces, is kind of like trying not to summarize, or trying not to interpret what other people say. So it's sort of very specific things that I remember from Dance Engaging Science. It's sort of like my desire at that moment. I'd just come in, and I sort of like and I saw that in some of the scientists as well. It's sort of this desire of, okay, but what can we do with this? Like, what can we do with this right now? You know, how can we make this useful for us? You know, so, and I guess a similar thing. I don't know if that has a mirror on the on the artistic side, but sort of resisting that and allowing in the process sort of like the people who are not from your discipline or live with you to sort of, sort of just say, this is our problem. This is what a scientific experiment, this is what we would need. And then, or this is, more quickly, then let the other discipline come up with a solution, which may take some time and which may not be framed in the same words that I would use, but that has happened on multiple occasions, that artists have found solutions for a problem that we had. And so I think as a cultural thing of how to hold space, that's something that I've definitely, I remember that from Dance Engaging Science, and that's definitely something I've taken on. Sort of like just let the problem sit there. Try not to solve it for everyone.
Waiting.
Yeah, waiting.
Waiting for the bus. Any observations from the team? I feel like there's all the people who worked on the project. Charlie, also, do you have any thoughts on this kind of notion of things that are important to remember or notice?
I don't have any specific examples, but my mind's been zooming out a lot and thinking about what's important about this project historically, we could ask. And I was just thinking about this question of like, oh, the science and the arts, why are they separate, and why do we keep using different language, and da-da-da. And thinking that, well, they haven't always been separate. Scientists and artists, the term scientist and artist didn't used to be separate terms. The term science, I think, used to just mean knowledge, I think, or like a way of knowing. And that science and art as fields, or science and philosophy, you could say, and I think philosophy just gets lumped with art because it seems like it's a bit woolly and weird, and so, that's kind of over there, and the science is now over here, that developed as a historical process for a lot of different reasons, and a lot of forces at work that are beyond our control. But I think what is possible is to recognize that it's not inevitable that they stay separate forever, and that the disciplines are always at odds with each other. And I think what's apparent in this project is that they don't have to be at odds with each other. That perhaps if science has come to be synonymous with like a sort of separation of mind and body, or a sort of mastery over the physical world, that there is another science that's possible. There's another way of doing things, just as there's many different ways of making art, which might conform to this sense of mastery, or it might subvert it. Yeah, I think that's it.
Thank you. I think this project held some of that in it. I suppose that currently the social cultural situation here, at least in this country, in this English-speaking context, is such that those the institutions of education funding have done that separating for us in a way. We've got the EPSRC, we've got the AHRC, the ESRC. So we're kind of, the environment is already sort of predisposed to separation. And I think and maybe that's what I meant, Charlie, when I said you wouldn't want to create a new field of dance and science, because it'd be very hard to destabilize those rather large kind of things that are in the environment, that are the ways in which people, begin their career in science and they progress and begin their career in art. So it's hard to imagine those things just suddenly shifting. It's this big tectonic plate shifting. But nevertheless, within this project, recognizing that those things don't need to remain distinct, I think it gets at this notion of what, these things that take place in a very special way in these relationships between you, where you don't, the moments that Laura and Ben talked about a little bit, where that separation dissolves on some level. I mean, forgive me, that's my interpretation. It kind of dissolves, so it's kind of no longer there, but it's very particular to a certain situation, a certain time, but whether you could amplify that, I guess, within a project so that became, again, foregrounded somehow as an you wouldn't want to call it an output because you'd just stumble into that furry territory, but you'd want to, I just think it's worth noticing that holding, the witnessing by others, the curation, the workarounds, the learning and letting go. I don't know, I'm just grabbing a bunch of things that seem to me to be almost like principles at operation, that you could say, okay, we're going to do this, let's just say these are important. There's a handful of things that we want to keep in mind. And maybe even talk about them a little bit, which wouldn't fix them. It wouldn't necessarily do that kind of weird thing of naming them and saying these are the things we need, but it might be just a way of the community paying more attention to them and saying these are important bits and pieces of the nature of the relationships we have here, and that's all I was thinking really. I don't know. I'm so aware that my friend is here, listening to ramble on, and I would certainly invite you to say something if you'd like, but I'm no pressure at all, Phil.
I think I will make one observation, because I've been fascinated.
Wait, you're getting a mic.
Thank you. I've been fascinated to listen to it all, but of course I haven't been here for the last 2 days, so I don't have enough of shared reference to offer terribly intelligent comments about it, because there's always this danger that you'll be a boring old man who just kind of comes out with some abstract wisdom. But one thing I did think was particularly interesting about this notion of what might get lost at the end of something like this, and the other side of that coin, it seems to me, which is really important, is that so much is latent and doesn't get exposed in the course of the dialogue. So if you rephrase the question into what is latent and important in this interaction that we in some sense haven't noticed as we've been going along, then how would we make that articulate such that it would not be forgotten? And I'm reminded of many of the things that happened in our own collaboration over the years, where trying to figure out what was latent in that actually then led to this idea of developing a way of probing an audit trace for these things. Because even as a young scientist, when I first went to Cambridge, I was absolutely terrified. I went to a high-status research unit full of very famous scientists. I hadn't got a clue what they were doing. I used to go to these meetings with them in which they would say terribly profound things, and I'm sitting in the back going, how the hell did he get there? How the hell did she get there? I had no idea what their inferential processes were. They just seemed to be doing things in ways that were very, very clever and that were beyond me. And it was because what they were doing was a sophisticated craft that they'd learned through doing it over the years. And I, of course, acquired some of those skills as I went along and terrified the next generation without necessarily noticing it. And so the point about part of what we were engaged with was the notion of how is it that you probe what is latent? How is it that you get things exposed such that they won't then get lost? So, I mean, I'm reminded of one of the techniques that Scott and I developed, process and concept tracking, where we got Wayne to articulate things about his choreographic process, where I just went in with a protocol and asked him a bunch of questions. And he found it quite interesting because I forced him to make articulate things that he didn't know that he knew. And once they were there, he could then use them and communicate them. And so I'm intrigued by the notion here that there may be ways in these kinds of things to actually expose that as you go along as a part of an aspect of an interdisciplinary methodology, which is not just to talk at each other or to develop language, but to actually probe in interesting ways that might expose what's important in that particular interdisciplinary context. I'll shut up now.
Can I? I don't know if there's ever the time to do this, but I use the concept of peeling back And what happens quite often in these setups, very understandably, is that you meet each other head on with what you want to do now, or what you want to spill out into the future. Whereas to some extent, if you peel back a little bit and start to expose one of the reasons you might be here, or how you became a dancer, or how you became a scientist, that's a bit too pragmatic. But something that Hennie said earlier when describing what are you thinking about when you're dancing, something like that. And it is everything. You're thinking about everything when you're dancing, and dancing allows you to be that everything, even if you can't articulate it, particularly at any particular moment. What I don't want to divide too much, what scientists seems to be doing is they're doing everything, but they're channeling it at this particular moment into what they are asking themselves. So in the channeling, which is, I do understand what you need to do, the forgotten is all the information you had reached before you channeled, before you got up and danced, before you made a particular kind of request in science. It makes me, I'll be very quick because I'm going to lose my voice. I get fascinated by the fact that we are made up of only about 20 elements. Is that true? The body is only 20 elements? Okay, I'm going to say it is, but something like that. I looked it up quite recently. Now, those elements turn into different materials, but I believe we're made up of about 20 elements. So these 20 elements could be described as scientific, or they could be described as artistic, depending on the human being who is alive with these 20 elements, what their sense of direction leads them to. But they began with all the same materials. Sometimes I find that fascinating, that with the same materials we decide to hone ourselves into these different passages. Enough of that.
I think thank you, Sue. Thanks, Phil. I think that I think not things that wouldn't be forgotten, and maybe that's why when I heard over the last few days people reflecting on moments that took place, and I thought, well, let's not forget that happened. But it's not. They don't show up in the outputs. I think this is a simple way of framing it, and so how can more attention, how can they be probed or brought forward somehow? And I don't have an answer for that necessarily, but I thought that in terms of, given that there's been so many conversations about interdisciplinarity this whole few days, from different perspectives, like how are outputs interdisciplinary, how are the teams working together, all kinds of very articulate expressions of related to interdisciplinarity. I thought I would just like to draw attention to that dimension, that aspect. And that's really what's the only goal here. I think that it's been for you guys, quite a long period of time. Why don't we take a break, if that's all right? And then we come back for the final session, right? Is it half an hour and then come back at 4? Thank you very much. And we'll see you back here, for those who are staying, at 4 o'clock. For the final session with Sue, Annie, and Kat, I believe. I mean, I did notice in this, one of the things that was mentioned was SDS, which if you're not listening carefully, you think is Scientific Technology Studies, but it's not. It's Srivandevi Studios, where Kat and Annie are here and have provided the space for this project to happen in, and which is also fundamental. You've said it a few times, so I think it's really appropriate that you guys are here to share a little bit of that with us at the end. So, all right, thank you very much.